In a town in Nigeria, where the streets were always busy with traders selling their goods and the sound of cars honking, there lived a little girl named Grace. Grace was 8 years old, with bright eyes and a heart full of love. She lived with her father, Mr. James, in a small but cozy house. Their home was filled with family photos and the smell of delicious jollof rice on the weekends. Grace's father, Mr. James, was a kind man. He worked at a bank and took care of Grace all by himself because Grace's mother had passed away when she was very young. Mr. James loved Grace dearly, and he did his best to make sure she was happy. He helped her with her homework, cooked meals, and read her stories every night. Even though he was busy, he never missed any of Grace's school events. Grace knew her father loved her very much, but she could see that sometimes he felt lonely. Grace's teacher, Sarah, was one of Grace's favorite people. Sarah was young and very kind. She had a big smile that made everyone in the classroom feel happy. Sarah loved teaching, and she made sure that all her students understood their lessons. Grace noticed that Miss Sarah always stayed after school to help any students who needed extra help. But there was something else Grace noticed about Sarah: she seemed lonely too. Miss Sarah never talked about a husband or children, and no one ever came to pick her up after school. One day, while Grace was sitting in class, she came up with a clever idea. She thought that maybe her father and Miss Sarah would make a good pair. They were both kind and caring, and they both seemed a little lonely. Grace decided she would bring them together. Grace started her plan by talking about her father a lot in class. She would say things like, "My daddy makes the best jollof rice. You should come and taste it one day, Miss Sarah." Or, "My daddy loves reading books, just like you, Miss Sarah." Sarah would smile and say, "Your father sounds like a wonderful man, Grace." Grace was happy that Miss Sarah was interested. She continued to find ways to bring her father into conversations. She brought drawings from home to show Miss Sarah, pictures of their house, books her father had read to her, and even a small container of jollof rice her father had made. Miss Sarah would always compliment Mr. James, saying how talented or thoughtful he was. Grace could see that her plan was working. After a few weeks, Grace decided it was time to take the next step in her plan. One Friday afternoon, after all the other students had gone home, Grace walked up to Sarah with a shy smile. "Miss Sarah," Grace said softly, "my daddy is picking me up today, and he made some jollof rice for dinner. Would you like to come and taste some?" Sarah looked surprised. "Oh, I wouldn't want to impose, Grace," she said kindly. Grace's eyes were big and hopeful. "It wouldn't be an imposition at all, Miss Sarah. Daddy always makes extra food. Please come." Sarah thought for a moment, then smiled. "All right, Grace. I would love to meet your father and try his famous jollof rice." When Mr. James arrived, he was surprised to see Sarah standing with Grace. He had heard so much about Sarah from Grace and was curious to meet her. Mr. James greeted her warmly, and Sarah smiled back. "Good evening, Sarah," Mr. James said politely. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you." "The pleasure is mine, Mr. James," Sarah replied. "Grace talks about you all the time." As they walked home together, Grace was filled with excitement. She couldn't wait to see what would happen next. Their home was simple but welcoming. The walls were decorated with family photos and colorful drawings Grace had made. The smell of jollof rice filled the air, making the house feel even cozier. Sarah immediately felt at home. She admired how Mr. James had made such a warm and loving environment for Grace. Over dinner, they talked and laughed, sharing stories about their lives, their interests, and their dreams. Grace watched them with a smile, knowing that her plan was working. Mr. James and Sarah discovered they had a lot in common. They both loved reading and enjoyed learning about history. They shared their favorite books and talked about the authors they liked. Sarah was impressed by how much Mr. James knew, and Mr. James admired Sarah's passion for teaching. They both enjoyed the conversation so much that time seemed to fly by. As the evening went on, Grace could see that her father and Sarah were starting to become friends. They laughed a lot and seemed very comfortable with each other. Grace was happy to see that they were getting along so well. After that evening, Sarah started visiting more often. Sometimes she would come over to help Grace with her homework, and other times she would stay for dinner. Each time she visited, Grace noticed that her father and Sarah grew closer. They would talk and laugh, and sometimes they would even go for walks together. One evening, as they were sitting together after dinner, Grace noticed something special between her father and Sarah. They were looking at each other with affection, and Grace knew they were starting to like each other more than just friends. She felt a warm feeling in her heart, knowing that her plan was working even better than she had hoped. As time passed, Mr. James and Sarah's friendship grew into something more. They started spending more time together, going out on weekends, and even attending church services as a family. Grace was overjoyed to see her father so happy, and she loved spending time with Sarah. One day, Mr. James and Sarah sat Grace down in the living room. They looked a little nervous, but they were both smiling. "Grace, my dear," Mr. James began, holding Sarah's hand, "Sarah and I have grown very close, and we've decided that we want to get married. How would you feel about having Sarah as your new mommy?" Grace's heart was filled with joy. She had dreamed of this moment ever since she came up with her plan. "I would love that, Daddy. I love Sarah so much," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around them. Sarah hugged Grace tightly. "I love you too, Grace. I promise to be the best mommy I can be." Not long after, Mr. James and Sarah got married in a small, joyful ceremony surrounded by family and friends. Grace was so proud, knowing that she had brought them together. She walked down the aisle as the flower girl, her heart bursting with happiness. The ceremony was simple but beautiful, and the community came together to celebrate the new family. Grace's home was now filled with even more love and laughter. Sarah moved in, and the three of them quickly settled into a new routine. They had family dinners every night, went on outings together, and spent their evenings reading and sharing stories. Grace also loved the new bond she had with Sarah. They would spend time baking, doing arts and crafts, or just talking about their day. Sarah treated Grace like her own daughter, and the bond between them grew stronger every day. From that day on, Grace was known as the little matchmaker who brought her father and her beloved teacher together. The story of how Grace had brought them together became a favorite tale in the neighborhood. People often talked about how a little girl's clever plan created a new, happy family. As the years went by, Grace continued to be the light of her parents' lives. She did well in school and made her parents proud with her achievements. With the love and support of her new family, Grace knew she could achieve anything she set her mind to. Grace's story became a reminder of the power of love, family. Her clever plan had brought happiness to her father, her teacher, and herself, creating a new family that would always be filled with love. The end. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel for more interesting videos.